Some 50 4-H boys and girls from Ontario County gathered on the shores of Canandaigua Lake in August of 1925 to spend a week with their fellow 4-H campers. The cost was $7 a week, and there was 1 week for boys and another week for girls. There were 6 main goals to opening summer camp that first year in 1925. First, to give 4-H club boys and girls a healthful, happy vacation through the freedom and inspiration attained by living in the outdoors. Second, to develop self-reliance, perseverance, cooperation, self-discipline, and an appreciation of nature. Third, to create an interest among parents and local people in promoting the 4-H club activities. Fourth, to hold the interest of young people and to develop leadership that will carry on local clubs throughout the winter. Fifth, to furnish an opportunity to 4-H instruction, health practices, supervised recreation, and handcraft. Sixth, to create a feeling of good fellowship and friendliness among the boys and girls and their leaders. Each of these purposes still holds true today, although we now reach many more of the children than we did in those first few years. This video will walk us through nearly 100 years of 4-H camping history in Ontario County. Between 1925 and 1936, the 4-H camp rented property along the lake, bouncing back and forth between Onaka, now known as Tory Beach, and Gorham, and right here at Point Rochester, which is now known as Ononda Park. Camp provided tents, while campers were to bring their own cots and even their own utensils for meals. In 1928, the 4-H program hired a young kid by the name of Art Woodard, still in college, to head the 4-H program. That summer, Woodard did something that was revolutionary for the time. He allowed boys and girls to come and camp together for the first co-ed camp in New York State. By 1935, Woodard was looking for a new place to call home for camp, and had begun looking for land in Bristol. Through the years, he had made the acquaintance of Marjorie Maxwell, who was married to Ogden Letchworth, and they owned land here in the Bristol Hills. By the end of 1935, Woodard had struck a deal with Maxwell to lease 20 acres of land for the 4-H camp. The camp would become known as Camp Letchworth, and the lease continued until 1939, when 4-H purchased the land for $1. Camp continued to meet at Onaka Point through the 1936 season, while cabins and the dining hall were being built in the new site. The initial construction included the original dining hall, a handful of cabins, and the original swimming pool, which was built in the ravine behind the camp. Work was completed by the Works Progress Administration in 1935 and 36, and the cabins were built using redwood timber harvested in California and brought to the camp by train. Redwood was known for its rot, fire, and insect resistance, and the cabins originally built almost 100 years ago still stand today. By June of 1937, the camp officially opened in the Bristol Hills. The property was dedicated August 1st, 1937, and 238 4-H'ers attended the camp over the course of the 3-week season. In addition to the 4-H camp program, the land was also rented out to a variety of community groups, including the Girl Scouts, the University of Rochester, the Finger Lakes Sportsman's Club, and the Home Bureau Camping Program. In all, nearly 6,000 people used the camp that summer. The following summer, the camp also hosted the New York State 4-H Leaders Camp for 124 4-H agents, which continued from 1938 to 1940. While the camp was being built, Art Woodard and Marjorie Maxwell continued their friendship, and Maxwell ended up selling Woodard a parcel of land adjacent to camp on its northern border. The cost of this real estate? 1 horse. Maxwell was a world-renowned horse trainer, leading workshops in Canada and throughout all of Europe. On his parcel of land, Woodard built a cabin that was used as a summer home for his family. I recently spoke with Woodard's son, John Woodard, who followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a 4-H agent. John remembers planting the row of pine trees along the service drive to camp, which at the time served as the property boundaries between camp and the Woodard property. John tells me that the construction of the family cabin was also done by the Works Progress Administration using the same redwood timber that was used to build the main camp. The cabin also never had its own water supply, but was always serviced by the camp's well. In 1940, Art Woodard left his post as 4-H agent and moved his family to the Buffalo area, but continued to spend weekends here in the family cabin right next door to camp. When Woodard retired, Ed Cochran was hired as the next agent. Cochran would go on to become the longest tenured 4-H agent, providing leadership for the camp from 1940 to 1972. It was early in this era that camp opened its doors beyond Ontario County and began accepting 4-Hers from a 14-county region. In 1941, camp had 314 campers over a 4-week season. Of course, the United States was heavily involved in World War II, and starting in 1941, the camp was officially known as the 4-H Club Victory Camp at Camp Letchworth, a name that it would hold throughout the war efforts. Enrollment continued to climb throughout the war years, and by 1944, camp was running 6 one-week sessions and serving 579 children. After the war ended, the camp once again changed its name, dropping the war reference and simply going by the name Ontario County 4-H Camp. Once World War II ended, soldiers came home. Camp, which had largely been seen as a respite for children amidst the stresses of war, now saw numbers declining as families spent more time together during the summers. At the same time, the polio pandemic was surging, and camp was cut back to 5 weeks, then 4, then 3, and by 1949, camp operated for just 2 weeks each summer. During these years, while camper numbers were down, camp continued to add and improve infrastructure, including a new roof to the main lodge, the construction of Tuscarora, the craft lodge, now known as Woodcraft, the basketball court, medicine man, and longhouse, as well as the overhaul of the kitchen drainage, installation of electricity to all cabins, and a new walk-in cooler for the kitchen. We also added lights and a sound system throughout the villages. Jonas Salk began developing a vaccine for polio in the early 1950s, which started being administered to school children in 1954. By 1956, we were back to running 6 weeks of camp each summer, with the highest one-week enrollment reaching 200 campers. Campers in this era referred to the camp as the Finger Lakes 4-H Club Camp because only 4-H members from the counties surrounding camp were permitted to attend. With camp back in full swing, we hired our first camp director in 1957. Prior to that, each of the 4-H programs in the region was responsible for planning and implementing the camp program for their own youth for 1 week each summer. Hiring one camp director for the season allowed us to hire a consistent staff for the entire summer, and ultimately opened the door for us to begin serving non-4-H members, which it did just a few years later. Ever since the camp opened here in Bristol in 1937, campers splashed and played here in the pool in the ravine behind camp. This pool measured 80 feet wide by 160 feet long and ranged from 3 to 5 feet deep. By 1958, however, the water quality and the physical structure of the pool was beginning to decline, and the Department of Health began to urge us to abandon this location and consider building a new pool elsewhere at camp. Just a year later, the Department of Health condemned this pool. The campers were bused into Kershaw Park for swimming instruction for the 1959 season. That year, $35,000 was appropriated for a new swimming pool, and the camp fees went up by $2 a week to help offset that cost. The board was concerned that the higher cost would affect camp enrollment, so they cut back camp from 6 weeks to 5. The 1960 season began with campers being bused to Kershaw, but by midsummer, our new pool was up and running in its current location. The camp continued to grow through the 1960s, allowing us to add Big Chief, Canoga, and Red Jacket in 1964 and Cayuga in 65. The now famous Bristol Hills Music Camp debuted its first program for 1 week in 63, expanding to 2 weeks in 64. By 1966, we had almost 1,700 campers, including 140 music campers. This also marks the time that camp began to expand its physical boundaries, with nearly 6 acres being purchased from the Carey family in 1965, and another 7.5 acres being purchased in 67. Art Woodard passed away in 1967, and the following spring, his widow sold a cabin and 4 acres of land to the 4-H camp for $11,500. The camp began extensive renovation of the building, converting it into a teen center, which would open a year later in 1969. In 1970, camp was at its peak of enrollment, with 1,750 campers registered over the course of an 8-week season. After 32 years at the helm, Ed Cochran retired his post at the end of the 1972 season, but he didn't go very far. He transitioned into a new role as the camp manager, essentially a caretaker for the facility 7 months out of the year, while Niles Brown was brought on as the next 4-H agent. The New York State Department of Health instituted cabin capacities in 1973, which greatly reduced the number of campers that we could accommodate. Prior to that, we would continue to accept campers right up until opening day, and if we had more campers registered than we had beds for, the last ones to arrive would sleep on the floor. That may seem incomprehensible by today's standards, but in those days, it was common practice and nobody blinked an eye. Unfortunately, we were already well into the registration season and already had more campers registered than we had beds for. Variances were requested and granted, but it was clear we were going to need to add cabins in order to accommodate our growing enrollment. Minnehaha, Owl's Feather, and Seneca were added to camp in 1975, increasing our capacity by 41 more campers. In early March of 1978, the main lodge at camp collapsed under high winds and heavy snow just 3.5 months before the start of camp. The only piece left standing was the fireplace behind me. The entire season was in jeopardy, and the 4-H staff was going to have to work quickly if there was any chance to salvage the season. A major fund drive was established, and Suzanne Kennedy led the committee. Ontario County's Board of Supervisors pledged $78,000, leaving Kennedy and 4-H agent Niles Brown to raise an additional $78,000. It was truly a grassroots effort, with 4-H clubs leading bake sales, chicken barbecues, and other fundraising efforts, while the committee reached out to major businesses, service organizations, politicians, and even federal assistance programs. The collapsed building was cleared and construction began long before the committee met their fundraising goals. But the building was completed July 1 so that camp could open July 2nd. In the late 1970s and into the 80s, camp began exploring a number of new programming efforts. A new cupcakes and saws class was developed to bridge the gender gap between these popular activities. A 3-tier counselor and training program unveiled in 1979, family camp in 1980, and Camp OK for overweight teens in 1981. The first ropes course elements were built across the road in 1984, opening the door for adventure camp beginning in 1986. The ice storm of '91 took out that entire course, but the new course was built here on the main camp in 1993. Sprout Camp for younger campers and a tripping program for teens also both launched in 1986. In 1995, Dean DeAngelis, who owned 85 acres of land in the original Maxwell and Letchworth estate, passed away. In his will, he left the entire property to the 4-H camp. This transfer completed in 1997, tripling the size of the 4-H camp property. It also gave us access to a large storage barn and the DeAngelis home. The property has largely been left natural, and you can still see evidence of its agricultural roots, including this barn and the horse racing track, which is still clearly visible in the aerial photos. The DeAngelis home itself was in poor condition. It was taken down in a controlled burn by the Bristol Fire Department in 2005. Over the years, the camp has had a number of different names, from Camp Letchworth to 4-H Victory Club Camp, to Ontario County 4-H Camp, to the Finger Lakes 4-H Clubs Camp. In 1996, the name was changed to Bristol Hills Camp. For the first time, the 4-H was taken out of the name over concern that some people might think that you had to be a 4-H member to attend. By 1999, however, with a new 4-H program leader, the name was changed once again to 4-H Camp Bristol Hills as we know it today. In recent years, 4-H Camp Bristol Hills has partnered with the faculty on campus at Cornell University to provide a number of outreach programming efforts at camp. Our STEM camp and food science camps We're the largest programs that come from these collaborations, but we've also done a number of projects on expressive writing, geospatial science, neuroscience, and a staff development project called Simple Interactions. These programs have given us the opportunity to connect with Cornell faculty and graduate students to deliver exceptional programs that have helped camp tremendously over the years. We've also developed a number of master camps, drawing on community connections to provide professional level guest instructors for very specific programs. Our culinary master camp partners with the New York Kitchen and the University of Rochester's Thompson Hell. Our animation camp brings in a videographer and professional graphic designer from North American Brewing. And this year, we're excited to unveil a new master camp in digital photography, done in conjunction with the members of the Finger Lakes Photography Guild. Camp is certainly alive and thriving. In 2019, we saw the highest numbers of campers since the 1970s. We're gearing up for another amazing summer, and we're excited about what the future may hold. We have big plans, and I hope that you'll be part of us this summer and for many years to come. Thanks for watching.